what was that period of your life like? The period of your life that, at least in commercial terms, were the most fruitful? Was that fulfilling?
It was. It's great to see, that people are appreciating what you're doing. I mean, we were going around at that time. My first single was like Lady Dub on Feel. And, that was suddenly riding high in the charts, and suddenly I'm there along with Free doing their thing, and Mungo Jerry doing their thing. And I'm there singing this quiet sort of madrigal thing called Lady Dub, inspired, by the way, I would say, by Peter Green an awful lot. God bless him. So anyway, this happened, and then, of course, the next album really did it, and that was Tea for the Tillerman, because then it was like Wild World and Father and Son, and suddenly everybody, got to know Cat Stevens.
Yeah. And then, but presumably this was in terms of personal fulfillment limited, but certainly in comparison to your ongoing spiritual journey, because you made what in retrospect still seems like a radical decision to convert to Islam, to change your name, and to sort of the renunciation of fame. In a sense, it is an apostasy of type, because in an economic and materialistic society, to renounce fame, one of the great icons of our systems, of our secular faith, is an act of secular apostasy. I'm happy with that bit of language. So, like, even today, it seems like a controversial thing. Perhaps like Islam has become more maligned in the sort of Anglophonic West since then. But did you have an awareness of how controversial what you were doing was?
Well, that came, of course, later. But I was daring, I would say, in as much as I was able to pass through certain thresholds which had been placed there by, whoever and whatever, and your circumstance, your social surroundings, and your upbringing, your culture. I wasn't English, but I was. But then, my father was Greek, my mother was Swedish, and I was kind of a free spirit. I didn't really belong to anything, and that was very important, I think, and the same as what I was in school. I was like, I wasn't really in church with everybody else doing what they were doing. So that gives you a hint of why I was able to, at a certain point, when I was given some sight of another way of looking at God, that what enabled me to go forward, and that is the most important thing. I think one of the greatest discoveries was for me to find, with Islam, it was like to find a religion that was devoted entirely to God. I didn't have to become a Jew. I didn't have to become a monk or a priest. It was actually the thing that opened my heart when I read the Quran, which was about 1975, so about 5 years later after Tillerman, was when I came upon the story of Joseph. And it was that story. The same thing, we've got all the prophets are in the Quran, by the way. I'm sure you know that, and maybe some people don't, but, they're getting to know. And Prophet Joseph was like he'd gone through all these changes. And, of course, at a certain point, people didn't really know who he was. And he was a slave, and he was sold as a slave. And finally, he got his way out of there, and then he made it to the rich house. It was all this, and I found so much semblance with his story. And at one point, when the brothers came to Egypt to get their food, and he was in charge of all the treasure, the stock houses, and when they said something bad about him, they didn't know he was facing them. He broke down. He broke down with them, but he didn't show them. And it was that where I realized that who I was, that I wasn't what people maybe make make me out to be or what I made myself out to be. I was, and that's why I chose the name Yusuf, by the way, in the end. This is Joseph, because I broke through. And I was given so many enlightening, stages along this journey. I was just so grateful to find this religion where I could devote myself to God, and wow, that was that again, of course, is the beginning of what happened next. But because there's a lot that goes on after that.
Because a lot of what of what I know about your life, I other than your musical genius, I identify with as like, oh, this is what it's like to feel alienated as a kid. This is what it's like to feel like you never fit in. This is what it's like to become famous and to recognize that fame isn't fulfilling. This is what it's like to put together a personal ideology made up of Hinduism, Buddhism, yoga, Christianity, folklore, mythology, and to deify and worship, in a sense, your own art. In my case, comedy, and obviously in your case, famously music. But the transition, the conversion, the devotion to follow one faith, and that's what is it in particular about Islam that called to you, particularly as given, as you've explained, that like the story of Joseph is like an Old Testament story also, and what is it particularly about the nature of Islam that you feel contacted you?
Well, I certainly wouldn't have been able to accept Islam if it was like full of superstitions and things which couldn't relate to the real world, right? And that, I would say, is the key. Because when I started reading the Quran, one of the things that just I woke up to was the Quran is full of directives to make you think, not to make you follow rituals, but to make you first of all think. So then it talks about, for instance, and I don't know any other scripture that does it to this degree, where it points you to the sun, it points you to the moon, and says, these are creations of God. And the night and the day is a miracle, and the fact that water falls and produces fruits and animals eat those grass and greenery and everything, all this is like signposts telling you that there is a creator and an almighty intellect behind everything that you see right there in front of you. That's very, very important, because it didn't mean I had to, believe some kind of unseen, dogma without having perfect evidence in front of me. And let me just tell you one more thing, because there was this missing part of the story, which was just before I got the Quran. I was swimming in Malibu, in kind of, I was like, California there, and I went out for a swim, and there was no one else really swimming that day, so it wasn't clever, and I did that. And then suddenly, wow, I think I'm going to try and make my way back. And of course, at that point, I realized I ain't going to make it. You've got fractions of seconds to decide what to do next. And I didn't have any hesitation. And I said, God, if you save me, I'll work for you. And then a wave came, a small wave, and just took me. And I had everything I needed now to get back. So people could say, oh, that's a coincidence. Hey, that's the most important coincidence ever happened in my life. As they say, coincidence is sometimes the way that God keeps himself anonymous. But this was no anonymous. This was me and God. And later I found, then the Quran came to me. And later, of course, I find that verse in the Quran. It says, oh, when the storm comes and they're at sea, they make their religion pure for God. That's it. So all these steps and signs, I was reading and were bringing me closer and closer. What could I do, Russell? What could I do? I had to submit. That's it.
Yeah, I really identify with what you're saying about recognizing that instead of looking for some peculiar dualistic proof of God, the lightning flash or the voice from on high, see in all things the divine beauty of nature and the potent intellect that we can read as being behind it. I identify strongly with that. I recognize those moments of terrified communion with God, and I identify too with what you're saying about feeling that God is all, that it seems like you've always had this yearning, this longing to be at one with God. I recognize that as well.